Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski, and joining me today from his corner suite on the St. Bonaventure University campus is my good friend, Dr. Philip Payne, chair of the history department. Phil, how are you today?
I'm doing well. Yeah, it's a good day. We just got out of class. Things are good.
So either there's been an incredibly bright supernova behind you, or you just have a lot of light out there.
We just have a lot of light. It's finally the sun's coming out here in Western New York. So we've gone through our 6 months of almost zero UV exposure, and we don't have a whole lot of sunlight. And yeah, so I do have a corner office. I'm generally very happy with it, but it's not great for like video podcasting.
There could be times of the year that that's just the snow in Western New York, the lake effect snow
Yes.
piled up to the windows, right?
I actually kind of look so completely aside here of nothing. I grew up in Ohio. The falls here are really nice. The summers are generally very nice as well. Spring is my least favorite season because it just drags on. And so I actually don't mind the winters and I don't mind the snow because it brightens everything up.
Well, that's true. That is
Yeah.
true. Otherwise, it's a brown and gray and muddy. Yeah.
Yeah. Like spring is brown and gray and muddy here. Winter is actually is cold, but once you get used to the snow, I don't mind it.
Yeah. Now, Phil and I are acting like we haven't seen each other forever, although we're co-teaching a class this semester. Much of it has been remote on my end from Central Virginia, where Phil's been hanging down the fort. And I asked him to come on to the podcast today so we could talk a little bit about our experience teaching about the Civil War this semester, because, I go to speak to a lot of groups, go to a lot of places, and they're always, kind of curious as to like what's the interest level for younger people, what's going through their head, how are they looking at this stuff. And um, I've had a wonderful opportunity to teach with Phil, who's just been wonderful to be in the classroom, and so I was excited about this and thought, hey, let's come on and talk about this a little bit. So Phil, you want to just maybe fill our listeners in for a second on sort of the premise of the class? How did we get to this spot in the first place?
Um, well, so one thing we're doing in the history department is we're always like asking ourselves like what classes would our students interested in? We teach a lot of courses for general education, meaning they tend to be survey classes. People can they take them because the university or the state of New York or somebody says you have to take this, and that tends to be on my side, typically something like a U.S. history survey. And we wanted to kind of expand the offering in that, and then we're like, the Civil War seems cool. Probably going to be a lot of interest in it. And it hadn't been taught since the person who had previously done the Civil War. We had a Civil War scholar here, Ed Eckert, and so it's probably 20 years since it had been taught.
He
Um,
retired, and then nobody filled that particular niche. And he
right.
was a licensed battlefield guide at Gettysburg, as I recall.
That seems right. Yeah, and I, he was I would had just joined the faculty, and when he returned to the faculty after having been provost, or I don't remember. Well, he was in that job. I can't remember what the exact title was, but right, chief academic officer. And so we were just looking around, and I was like, let's put the Civil War back in rotation. And I had my interest in it because I'm more of a 20th century interwar period guy. My interest in it had been growing because we'd been working a lot with the university archives and their Civil War collection. And so as we kept getting more and more into that, and I was like, well, let's just get this class out here. So we put it into books. And I thought, because you've come and talked to that class a couple times, because we use your book in the class, um, I just kind of reached out with an email saying, hey, anything from the emerging Civil War you'd like to use. And it seems like from there, we sort of backed into team teaching it, which is interesting because it's a relatively new policy letting us team teach on campus. So I just thought, super cool. Let's do it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And a metaphor we've used throughout the semester is like we're building the plane as we fly it.
Yeah. I think we'll get the student teaching evaluations, but I think the students are in a good place. But I think it's been really cool. Like it's been nice interacting with the students. We've got some good discussion. The range of guest speakers has been excellent. I've thoroughly enjoyed that, and you bringing them on and interviewing them. I think that's just been like I think that's a pretty unique, cool thing to have in a class.
Yeah. So and basically the way we have approached that is I've brought in colleagues from emerging Civil War, folks who are working out in the public history field, and basically done kind of podcast style interviews with them to get discussion going. And students would occasionally toss in with a question, would tie those interviews into stuff we were reading in the textbook. We chose The American War by Gary Gallagher and Joan Waugh. So a good overview sort of thing that didn't get nitty gritty. Um, and we sort of used that reading to guide these conversations. And I mean, to me, it was fun. Like, hey, let's just get together and kind of riff on the Civil War a couple times a week.
Yeah, I kind of approached that. Yeah, it was, yeah, I very much enjoyed that part of the class.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now, because this was a gen ed class, maybe a different approach than if this had been like an upper level survey class or an upper level seminar class for some seniors. Tell me a little bit about how the difference in approaches to those sorts of settings.
Um, so when you're doing like an upper level, like especially a seminar, when you got the majors in there, it's to my mind, it's usually a lot more reading intensive. Um, So one thing, and I guess I should preface this, the way I kind of think of this is when you have this gen ed class, so we've got the class, there's 28 students in it. Um, and I don't know what all their majors are, but they're from all over the university. And I teach a lot of classes that way. And I think of it as like an opportunity because this may be the one history class they're going to take in college. And this may be the last history class they take for the rest of their lives. So trying to, spark some interest, make them see the relevancy of history. When they come back to it, maybe at some point when they go in to vote or they're whatever, they're volunteering in the town election or whatever they're doing, they're touring a historic site. It has some resonance, right? It's like I don't expect them to know, especially in this day and age when we got Google, to memorize all the dates, but I like to remember like there's a date they should know and they know to look it up. Um, yeah, so provide some context for their lives. So the way, and that sort of is a way of how I kind of think about teaching these classes that have a lot of mix in that. So we do have some history majors. We have some adolescent ed majors who have a history focus, and they have a fairly good knowledge of historical background. But for a lot of the students, when you're teaching like this way, you need to remember that they may not have had a U.S. history class since, depending on what state they're in and various requirements, since maybe like eighth grade, ninth grade, maybe 11th. Um, and you don't know how good it was. So you kind of have to be, I find myself that I have to be careful, which is very easy to do, of going into the weeds on some topic and I'm deep into weeds on it and I've forgotten the big picture and what they need is the big picture. And then we can kind of work our way into the weeds. But if I just plunge straight into the weedy kind of stuff I'm liking, then I probably lost them, which is
Yeah.
a legitimate complaint on their part.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I even had a student say like, the conversations are really interesting, but sometimes it's hard to follow two people who really know a lot about it when they're talking about it, because
Yep.
you get into the weeds that way.
Yeah, I like to think of it as like if I walked over and two physicists were talking physics, like what would be, how would I follow the conversation? Uh, yeah, because I kind of, it's easy for me to assume that history is this common language for everyone, and that's not really true. That's just my assumption because I'm so steeped in it.
Now you talk about, kind of helping them find ways that it's still relevant in their lives. We had a lot to draw on from current events as we taught the course.
Yes.
Like, yeah, and history's happening all around us today, not just the process of history unfolding, but like history's in the headlines in a current events sort of way. What was that like for you to be able to kind of tap into that and then work those sorts of things into discussion?
I That actually happens a lot. I mean, right now it's particularly tense just because of the all the stuff going on around higher education and politics at the moment. The stuff with Harvard and Columbia, and your listeners can Google that stuff up. Um, but on the other hand, I also thought it was a time when it's really kind of important to talk about these things. And I'm also a believer like you have to have space in the classroom for the students to sort of figure out what they want to say. Right? Like it needs to be a safe space for civil discourse. So like particularly right now, like we talked a lot about the 14th Amendment. Um, and to my view is like, how are they going to form an opinion on birthright citizenship, right? We have the executive order on if they don't know anything about the 14th Amendment, right?
Yeah.
Like that's not all there is to the discussion, but that's a starting place for that discussion. That's foundational to it. Um, so I, at least how I teach history classes, this is actually relatively common to sort of tie it into current events. And, one of my other classes, I was doing the second half of the 20th century. And I was talking about the sort of rise of deindustrialization in the 70s and 80s. So, and I was like, this is what we're reacting to now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, tariffs. Tariffs big in the news right now.
Yeah.
Lots to draw on about tariffs.
Weirdly enough, because you assign books months before the class starts, we were reading a book that dealt a lot with Gilded Age politics and McKinley and tariffs
Yeah.
just as those hit. So I looked like I was a genius, like, but it was actually just kind of random, circumstance that like the tariffs hit as we're talking about the book that's got tariffs in it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
One of the other classes that you're teaching there. And now you use the word safe space. Undoubtedly, there's some listener who's now thinking, "Oh, those commie socialists, liberal professors, they're brainwashing our students." I really want to put to bed the idea that we're brainwashing students, because if they really did listen to what we said, then they would do their readings, they'd get their homework in on time. Like, like we don't have that all powerful ability.
No, I mean, part of it is, so I've been reading a lot of surveys and stuff about the stuff going on with history in K through 12. And there's surveys out there that the organization American Historians have done them, the American Historical Association. There's a group called Common Cause, actually founded by the Koch brothers are one of their sponsors. That there's actually a lot of consensus among Americans about what should be in their history class. And it's the political opportunists on the fringes who kind of push the idea that the sort of what you're just talking about. That's what we're doing. Plus, I mean, it way overstates my power.
Yeah.
Um, it just does. Um, and I would say like I've got students who are conservative. I've had students who are conservative. I've had students who are liberal. I think most of them are kind of apolitical. Um, and I don't know that I've ever just like converted one to like take a radically different position. I'm much more like we need to think these things through and be able to talk about them. Plus also just sometimes if you're trying to like take modern politics and push them backwards and sort of read them backwards, it doesn't work. Like the partisan labels fall apart, and what is considered conservative and liberal also kind of falls apart. You just can't, there's not a straight line backwards. Everything's much messier than that.
Yeah, yeah. One of the approaches that we took that I really enjoyed was, would have them read a chapter, and then like their homework would be just tell us something about the chapter that was interesting to you. Like, let's let you guys, drive the conversation in class, and let's just riff off the
Mhm.
sorts of things that are jumping out at you. And to me, that really kind of created some neat spur of the moment discussions, just like, oh, well, let's talk about this and let's talk about that. And, getting some back and forth between the students about some of those things. And to me, that's like the great spirit of inquiry. Like, we're just going to go in and ask some questions and see what we kind of come up with.
I think that's like super powerful. When I first started teaching, I did a lot of very traditional lectures, like what you think a history class should be. And I think I got reasonably good at delivering them. But the longer I've done this, the more I've moved away from just a traditional lecture. Yeah, it's much more powerful if students like engage with stuff, ask questions. It's like what you're saying. And also, I think you just remember it. If somebody tells you something, and then 20 minutes later you ask them like, "Well, what did so and so say?" And you're like, "I can't remember." But I think if you dig in and have that dialogue, yeah, you're much. Plus, I also think as we're sort of trying to figure out what to do with AI and all this new stuff. I think the Socratic method may be the thing we land on. Just the
Yeah.
fact we ask questions, have dialogues as human beings, might be the thing that survives our technological revolution as an effective pedagogical device.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to AI in just a second because obviously everybody in higher ed's grappling with that. But you'd mentioned something a second ago about, moving away from lectures, which is kind of the traditional way a lot of us think about the way history gets taught or got taught. Um, and you made a comment to me the other day that really kind of stuck with me, and that students today at least seem to want to be lectured to, or they seem to maybe expect that because it's you know, easy or it's what they expect. I don't know.
I think there's
Um,
a lot of it's what they expect in a history class.
yeah,
There's also some like studies, like you read the Chronicle of Higher Education, where like current Gen Z students, they're sort of averse to talking about controversial topics. I think maybe, and this is complete, I have no research to back this up. This is just my gut. But maybe because so much of our politics now are culture wars online, that they just don't want to do that. Like they just don't want to have that, like, let's just argue about stuff in the classroom, you know?
yeah,
And also sometimes I think, and again, I don't know the quality of their history background coming into this, but and again, I'm also sort of wondering, like, sometimes if like you or I come through and we're like, oh, we just know so much about history, and I think it's sometimes there's a little worried, like I'll just say they're a little worried I'll just say something and it'll be wrong.
mm,
So it's not just like your opinion about should the Bills do this with their cornerback or whatever. Um, so it's yeah. So I think, yeah, that's kind of what I think about trying to move away with lecture, but students do, they seem to prefer it, but it's also, to me, it's just very passive. And I think it's important we get them to engage with the materials.
yeah.
Yeah.
And we're also wrestling with that sort of, and they even call themselves COVID kids.
Hmm.
Their education was disrupted by COVID in a way that, most of us didn't have to deal with. And so the way they were taught sort of tends to be passive because they're kind of engaging on the computer necessarily, and
Yep.
so like they're used to just sort of having stuff poured in their heads and they're going to regurgitate it. Um,
And lives are increasingly our lives. I'm going to say their lives. I think all of our lives, as we said here, is mediated through screens.
yeah.
Um,
As
yeah.
is this discussion right
Yeah, that's kind of,
now.
yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, so I don't know. It's some ways I'm trying to offset that, you know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. The Socratic method, conversation, dialogue, and to me, that's just like a great pleasure. Just in general, conversation is just a good pleasure, and to be able to bring that into a classroom and talk about interesting ideas with people, to me,
Well,
is just a lot of
that's
fun.
one of the virtues of being in a school where the classes are relatively small. Like I went to grad school at Ohio State, and now they moved a lot of this online. So when I was there in the 90s, the internet was new and you couldn't just like online education was just, they were just sort of starting to talk about it. But they were, I taught classes of 300, like those big auditoriums. And they were trying to figure out how to do those classes with 800. Like it was a room and they were putting monitors up, um, and that in that case you are performing. You go out, you do a lecture. It's like a stage performance, because you can see the first two rows, and that's kind of that. Um, and so you're just sort of projecting out into the void, hoping they learn some things. And one of the good things about a school like Bonaventure is like we, a class of 28 is still not that big,
Right.
and we can have these discussions and interact with them, and yeah.
So you say that AI, that this sort of approach to discussion conversation is going to help us maybe survive AI. How are you seeing artificial intelligence impact what's going on in your classrooms?
I think there's just so much uncertainty around that right now. It's clear everyone's using it now, and it's also, at least my experience has been, where it's not clear we know how to talk about it. And I think so much of the discussion around AI has been around cheating, because it's very clear early on when ChatGPT was it 3.5 dropped, and all of a sudden you got this thing and you could write essays or whatever for you, and everybody's like telling it to write something or another in the style of the King James Bible or whatever. And but it was clear like it's one kind of use case. The thing that made it useful was that it could write papers. You could use it for cheating. Yeah. So it's sort of, on one hand, it disrupted and wiped out a whole industry of people who earned their living writing, ghostwriting papers for students. Um, so, and then there's like what did Chegg, the online tutorial thing that was essentially like you paid your subscription fee and it would like essentially help you cheat. That they're filing for bankruptcy. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, but I think that sort of stigma around it has made it harder to talk about AI because there's a vibe around it. They're like, oh, if I say I use AI, then they think we're cheating. So I've been really trying to emphasize to students, like, I want to hear your voice. I'm asking you what you think, and that writing is thinking. And that's why, like in this class, we got so many of these. Like, I really like these lightweight, kind of reflective pieces. If it may be imperfect, maybe the grammar needs fixed, maybe the capitalization is off, probably is. I don't know why we just started randomly capitalizing things and not capitalizing other things. That's a whole other discussion. Um,
Read enough stuff from the like 1700s, you'll see all sorts of weird capitalization
Very true.
conventions. Yeah.
And I always thought Teddy Roosevelt was right. I always thought the American spelling should have just been overhauled. Like,
Yeah.
I was like, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But yeah, I think so. We've been emphasizing this sort, like we do in class. We want to hear what you're thinking about it, and we've had those discussions with students. Like, writing is thinking, and you kind of start with that blank page, and you form your thought, and it's an iterative process.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm a little worried that writing and thinking will go the way of like the calculator effect. We'll all kind of forget our multiplication tables because we use a calculator so much.
Yeah. Wait till you have a second grader at home again. You'll relearn all of your multiplication tables.
That's probably
They're
true.
gonna
I
be
don't know, I've
gone.
completely forgotten mine, but I tend to plug all that stuff into a spreadsheet.
I've had a very adversarial relationship with AI so far, just because, usually I'm teaching writing classes in the journalism school. And so part of what I specifically teach are the rules. Like, you've got to learn the rules. Let's learn the foundations, learn the fundamentals so that you can then go break the rules later, more creatively as an artist. But you got to learn the rules before you can break them so that you're breaking them with intentional effect. And so if you do that through AI, then you don't learn the rules. You like
Yeah,
undercut the very reason you have to be in the classroom. And getting students to kind of understand that, just I wrestle with that all the time. So then coming over into the history department where we give students a prompt and we might get an answer from somebody, and then three answers later, you know, I get a very similar answer that maybe it's not word for word the same, but like the idea in this first sentence is the same in the this first sentence, and the idea in the second, and it was just like, this had to have been generated by AI, but how, and is that
yeah.
cheating? And and those are the sorts of things I've really been wrestling with this semester.
It is it's very hard. Yeah, no, because that's the challenge of AI. It's very hard to detect. Maybe borderline impossible. Now I've been reading some various newsletters and they're talking about the AI detectors, and it just seems like they basically don't work.
Yeah.
And I mean, I guess one thing that could be happening, and I see this, is that if you have a group that's by and large more or less homogenous, like our classes, right? Or more or less, they're all within a year or two or three of an age. Most of them are from a similar background. Not all of them, but a chunk of them, right? Um, and you give them a document and say, read this. There is a certain logic to they sort of come to this. A lot of them come to the same conclusion.
Right.
But like, I'm increasingly thinking we're going to have some way of thinking about discussing teaching in a way, and not in a way that I wanted this to sound condescending, because I'm not talking about basic literacy, but like linking reading and writing as like a way of like deep thinking. Like, like this is how you set aside the tech. And I like tech. Often an early adopter with stuff. I'm like, oh, cool, cool new gadgets, right? Um, but there's a place and time for us, like setting it aside. We're going to need I think we're going to need like a way of doing that. We're just going to read this book, read it closely, or article, whatever, think about it, and we're going to learn the rules of that discourse. Because otherwise I think it might go. That's my deepest concern. That will go away. Yeah.
We've had a couple good conversations between the two of us over the course of the semester about just the physical act of reading a book and how students really have a tough time with that, which is strange for us as historians. It's such a part of our culture, and yet
Yeah.
students struggle with books. Talk about that just a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't have an easy answer because I have throughout forever have just resisted the idea of saying like kids these days. Because I don't think on average that holds true. Or at least we're talking about people having a different experience, but not necessarily one being better or worse. Like I don't know when I was in high school and graduated from high school in 1983, if like there was like we were this groundswell of like future, people who are just like reading books all the time, and you know what I mean. So I'm not trying to overly the romanticize the past, but something has shifted.
Yeah.
And there is this, and I feel it in myself, even though I try to write books, I try to read a lot of books, but something shifted with our phones and our laptops that you have to make a concerted effort and set aside those things and be like, okay, now's my time for reading. But I also think that, and I think that's probably they're just not getting a lot of that, like is part of the childhood experience anymore. And that's not universally true. We've clearly got some students in class who like to read. They're asking about extra books to read, and they're going and checking them out at a library, and they're excited by it. But we also get students who just like, kind of openly talk about struggling to read things that are longer or maybe slightly more complicated.
So the first book that we started out with, aside from the text, The American War, we asked him to read two other books that I guess we might classify as dad history.
Yeah.
So The Demon of Unrest by Eric Larson, and then The Bloody Shirt by Stephen Budiansky. And The Demon of the Unrest, like we knew it was a thick book, but
Yeah.
Larson's got a great reputation for being super readable, big bestseller. I was
Lots of
surprised
white
by the
space on the pages.
Yeah, lots of white
Yeah.
space on those pages, even though it's a thick book, lots of white spaces. I was surprised at the outcome of that experience, though.
Yeah, I guess I wasn't totally shocked, but a little surprised because it's now become relatively common for students to just talk about not wanting to read, not liking to read. And again, like there's always been students who are like trying to figure out how not to read the book in a class. That's just reality. Um, but openly sort of talking about it. And what I kind of worry about is like, especially with folks who are going to be teaching history, it's like, where are they going to get their history?
Right.
Like when they need to like brush up on whatever the American Revolution for a new unit or something. And I'm a little worried.
They're watching and listening to podcasts.
Yeah, and I'm not opposed to podcasts. We both have some serious driving in our lives,
That's
and
right.
audiobooks and podcasts are a big part of getting through that. So I'm not trying to make it an either or situation, but it's just, yeah, I do kind of worry about like, yeah, like I was a little surprised they got the pushback on Larson, but not completely shocked.
Yeah. And in fairness to the students too, I'll say like we were sort of reading it a few weeks ahead of them by the time we got to them. And I was maybe a little underwhelmed by the book too.
Yeah, and I think that there's a couple of different critiques. There's the ones who have found the critique of the book, which I actually don't mind that. If the students are like, he didn't do what he said he was going to do, he fell short, that's fair. Like I actually kind of thought that of the book myself.
Yeah.
Um, it's another one when you don't want to like open up the book. That you just kind of look at it like I'm not going to open it. But like, and this was like in the senior seminar, we're reading books that are like that thick, but they're dense.
Yeah.
And we're just spending our time working our way through the book, talking about how they structure their argument. So that's probably maybe some of the difference here we're seeing. But
Right, right,
yeah.
yeah. And then with the bloody shirt, we're doing reconstruction, or we've done reconstruction at the end of the class, and a lot of students just that was like a part of history that they didn't know existed.
Yeah, not shocked. It strikes me as how much of our contemporary politics and culture stem from the Civil War and Reconstruction, and beyond superficial commemoration of it, I think a lot of people have no idea, like with especially with Reconstruction.
Yeah,
Um, yeah.
yeah. It's and we as guest speakers, we had Joe Ricky come in talk a little bit about stuff in Louisiana. Um, Trying to think, I've lost track of all of our guest speakers at this. Oh, Emma Murphy Novak came in and talked about Andrew Johnson early
Mhm.
Reconstruction and his impeachment. So they had the chance to listen to some guys, some folks who knew some real stuff, and it was neat to read their reactions to those discussions because they seemed interested. They were like, "I had no idea this happened." Um, so it was cool to see those light bulbs go off, I thought.
Yeah, and I think that's when a history class is at its best. Like a class like this, probably nobody in the class is going on to be a historian. But it's the light bulb moments, like, and then maybe what they're doing is they're visiting, I don't know, Gettysburg, or they're somewhere else. They're in Washington D.C. and they're like, let's go see Ford's Theater, right? Like this because the light bulbs have gone off.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so Gettysburg being one of those things people sort of have heard about, Abraham Lincoln. We started the class by saying, write down the things that you know about the Civil War and Reconstruction, just off the top of your head, so that we kind of knew what the baseline was. Do you remember what kind of those most common responses were?
Oh, no, I can't. Give me some prompts here.
I mean, because I mean, it seems
Yeah,
like Lincoln,
yeah,
and
yeah,
they remember Gettysburg. Um, I think most of them mentioned Fort Sumter only because we talked about having the book to read, and so that was kind of
yeah.
fresh in their mind. But it was like really big, broad picture stuff,
Yep.
but not any in the weed details for most of them.
Well, I think that's also just kind of generally true. Like
Yeah,
you pick most. I mean, maybe some of it's just generally we're not very historically focused in our culture, but like for like given the age of our students, like the Vietnam War is ancient history.
yeah.
Yeah, or let's put it this way: the first Iraq War is ancient history. Yeah,
Well, we took them out to the campus 9/11 memorial, which for
yeah,
them is history. They were all born
yep,
after that happened.
yeah, and it's sort of yeah, it's kind of what you have to kind of I have to kind of remind myself of that. And especially when we get into I kind of make it as a joke in class, but if I'm getting into teaching the later decades of the 20th century, I'll like refer to like, hey, you remember when this happened? And it's like, yeah, no, you don't.
It has been fun because you and I are pretty similar in age, and so one of us will drop some reference, and at least the other one gets it, even if the class
Yeah.
is sort of like, huh?
Yeah, no, we weren't even born with that.
Yeah, we one of the students was doing a pop culture presentation about the movie 12 Years a Slave, and a really hard movie to watch, intentionally so. And I was thinking, like, my first exposure to slavery in media was probably Roots. It was
Mhm.
probably, much different portrayal than what you see in the movie, and that's much different than Gone with the Wind. And we, start talking about these arcs, and you see students just sort of, they don't have that cultural grounding, I suppose.
No, LeVar Burton's long removed from Star Trek, much less
That's
much less Roots.
right.
They may remember him from reading Rainbow.
Yeah, maybe, perhaps, yeah.
Maybe. Yeah.
Uh,
Uh,
So
but
speaking of the pop culture assignment, so that you're kind of wrapping up the semester by having them choose a text, either a movie, a book, something like that, and sort of talk about it a little bit. And one of the points that we've made is it's a important entryway into history for people. And I know you've talked about that in a lot of your other classes. You want to talk about that power of pop culture for you as an instructor?
for me as an instructor, it's like it goes back to what I was talking about before. Like the students don't walk in as a blank slate. Like they're not just an empty vessel and I pour historical knowledge into their heads and then they leave having change their mind about everything. Like that's just not what happens. And so like the way that the stuff they bring in is either like maybe their family, like whatever their political or historical themes that come up in their family. Um, but a lot of it's going to be pop culture. Like a lot of it's like, what TV shows did they watch? What movies did they watch? Maybe they got into some historical fiction. But at this point, too, increasingly, and this is where I'm a little lost, because I don't play video games, but historical
Yeah.
video games, which opens up like a whole kind of interesting thing about alternative history. Um, but yeah, you'll get students who have seen, whatever, like you pick your TV show or something. And I think that's like an entry point. And I think it's also one of the things that was coming out in the presentation today is like the power of these mediums. Like a movie like 12 Years a Slave still carries a punch that is really hard to convey in like a classroom assignment. Um, or even sometimes in writing. I guess it depends on who did the writing and whatnot, but like there's just a power to that I don't think we can ignore, but I also think it's such an important part of like who we are. Because if you think about like our politics at the moment, or just of any moment in the last 20, 30 years, it's in a lot of ways our politics and our popular culture, you can't separate them anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think it's also important for them to sort of give some thought to the popular culture, like what, what am I, I'm not just mindlessly watching a TV show, although sometimes we do that. But a lot of times, if you're watching, Yellowstone, or what's that, 1923, or
Oh, yeah.
Outlander, or I don't know, there's like a ton more of them, right? There's a message in there, Sometimes there's a political message, sometimes it isn't, but like there's a way you're kind of framing how you understand the world.
Yeah, a great example of that just came up in the presentation that someone did about Red Badge of Courage, and a
Hmm.
wonderful, wonderful novel. Um, but then they had included a still from the John Huston version of the film, and they didn't watch the movie. They just sort of, here's a picture to help illustrate my PowerPoint slide. But it's Audie Murphy running with the flag into battle, replicating a scene from Henry Fleming running into battle with the flag, and the resonance of that image in the wake of World War II, John Huston making that movie, um, with the most decorated soldier in American history running forward with the flag. That's a that's a moment in time, not just the movie
Hmm.
based on the book. Like that's setting up the sort of
Yeah.
message that you're talking about.
Yeah, it's that layers upon layers upon layers, and it's that layers of like once upon a time in the United States, everybody would have watched that going like, that's Audie Murphy.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Like, and that memory's now faded. And for someone who's in their 20s, it just, unless they have like a very specific knowledge set, like, yeah, it just doesn't carry the weight, But at one point, it was, yeah, I mean, that might have. I kind of wonder if that would have overshadowed the recreation of the scene. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
Audie Murphy would have been the more important part of that picture than um um than um than the recreation of the novel.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Yeah.
and different versions of that movie have been made since, and they've kind of been different moments of their time as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you see movies like and also movies that try and capture this kind of sense of change of time, because I think ultimately that's kind of what history is about. Like a movie like Forrest Gump. Like a lot of our students like Forrest Gump. They love that movie. I always tell them it's a very disturbing movie. And they're like, no, that movie's great. I feel so good about it. And I'm like, well, who's the character named after? And they're like, oh, so, so, so it becomes like a good conversation, and it's a good movie. Like it's hard, like in terms of watching it, and it's got Tom Hanks in it, but you start thinking about like, oh, the Forrest Gump is named after the founder of the Ku Klux Klan, and he seems to have historical amnesia.
Yeah.
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 So, but yeah, but like students don't think about it that way. But that movie's got a real specific. This is how historical change happens vibe to it.
Yeah.
Um, that it's worth sometimes surfacing that sort of stuff.
So, just as a complete aside, that's the movie I quote the most, only because my wife's name is Jennifer, and I'll
Yeah.
say, "I love you, Jenny. I know what a good husband is." She has to listen to that all the
That's
time.
fine. And I hope I didn't like step on your toes like sort of dissing Forrest Gump, but it's not like I hate the movie. It's just like it's a movie worth some serious thought.
No, yeah, but there's a lot more going on in that movie than
Yeah.
people.
Well, yeah, we're just talking about layers and layers, and it's like I think that's a movie that's got a lot of layers to it.
Yeah. And we
Yeah.
spent some time unpacking the idea of historical memory and how that's different than history. Is that a concept you think that students get or don't get, or is
I,
it one of those light bulb opportunities?
I think it's a light bulb opportunity. I think I think it's a hard thing to wrap your head around until you've like spent some time sort of soaking in it. Because I think and this goes back to those studies I was referencing earlier. There's a general kind of idea that history is like these set of facts and they can't be changed and they're in the past. And that those memorials and the memory part of it is an outgrowth of that. And it's sort of like what you were talking about in class. Like people think, well, if I take down this statue of whoever, then we've erased their history. And I can kind of actually see the logic of that because if you think about, I don't know, Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union or whatever, Adolf Hitler, that's what they do. Like, especially Stalin, they literally would just like take people out of history books and pull down their statues. So there's a solid logic behind that, but I think sometimes it's hard to think about somebody created this thing in the past to influence how we think about their time and now and their future, right? That's like that's a little bit of a trippy concept.
Yeah, yeah. And I want to clarify for viewers. I I was saying that some people say when you take down a statue, you're erasing
Yeah.
history. I don't say that
Yes.
myself. I do a lot
Yeah.
of
True. Okay. Yeah. I'm
monument
not trying to
memory
put words
stuff,
in your
and
mouth.
people are like,
Yeah.
"Oh, look, he said you did."
Yeah.
But
We were actually having a very good discussion about
yeah, yeah,
the
and
pros
I
and
found
cons. Yeah.
students were really engaged in that discussion. I thought.
Yeah. It's a good discussion. And yeah. Yeah. So I wasn't trying to put words in your mouth. I was just like, yeah, this is
Yeah.
yeah.
So, as we, we're recording this at a time where we're in the home stretch. We're about to wrap things up. How you feeling about the semester overall?
I think it's been a good semester. I like it. I like that we put this class back in rotation. I think it's an important one. I'm super happy you are able to team teach it, and we can figure out how to iterate and evolve this going forward. Um, so, um, I got a list of things in my head that I'm thinking like maybe we could like work on and tweak on. Um, maybe around the readings, maybe introducing a little more video into the class in the sense of I don't know, the class was already so full that like that's the problem.
Yeah,
If you put something in, you have to take something out. Um, but maybe having them all have a watch a movie in common to give us like a something to talk about. I don't know what movie that would be, but just
yeah,
yeah, we all I don't know, Steven Spielberg's Lincoln or something. I don't know. We pick a movie and we're like, oh, we're all going to watch this and we're going to have a discussion about it as a group. Um, I so yeah, there's got some ideas, but generally speaking, I think it's been a good semester. What about you?
yeah, yeah. Likewise, just some things to tweak. I think that overall it was a really great opportunity for me to be able to come and teach a history class and work with a great co-instructor. I learned a lot, and I had really, I mean, probably the thing I'm walking away with the most are just the sorts of discussions you and I have had about the discipline and the teaching and just, approaches to thinking about history. It's been really a lot of fun for me. Um,
Yeah,
and
I always think you learn so much teaching with somebody else.
yeah, yeah,
I,
for
I think
sure.
it's just I think it's an experience everybody should have in their educational career.
Yeah, and it was just a great serendipitous surprise. I mean, you and I have known each other for a long time, but it was just great serendipity that we got in the classroom, and I thought the chemistry was really good, and just sort
Yeah,
of being able to
we
click.
I think we have a very similar like thought. We think very similarly about how to do this.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
But I do look forward to the opportunity to sit down over a cold, frosty beverage and
Yep.
deconstructing the semester. The best history
Yep.
takes place over beer and cigars.
Well, I'll go for the beer. I'm not much for cigars, but you can do cigars if you want. I'm not here to judge.
That's all right. That's all right. So, any final thoughts that you'd offer our listeners just about, kind of ways to think about what's going on in history classrooms today? It's a big question.
Um, I think it's yeah, I'll offer this thought. Like whenever we're having one of these national discussions and somebody comes out and they're like, we gotta like whatever, clean up our history classes. Before jumping on the bandwagon, try to find out what's actually going on in the history classes. And I think that you'll find that a lot of it's better and more useful for society. Because I think one thing would be good that would for us right now is just to have a little more history. I don't know that we need more historians, but I think we need more historical perspective.
Yeah. And, kind of along those lines, maybe I would add that, a lot of people get critical of like, oh, you're judging these people in the past, but maybe don't judge what's going on in these classrooms either. If you
Yes.
don't know what's going on,
Yeah.
don't do to us what you don't want, what you think we're doing to folks in the past,
I teach a lot of people who go off to be history teachers, and they're almost to a person doing it because they love talking about history.
Yeah.
They're not doing it like I've never sat down and had a discussion about how do I inflict my ideological agenda, whatever that agenda is on, middle schoolers. That I've literally never had that discussion. Um, I have had discussions, and you've had them with me now too, with students like, how do we go about teaching good history? How do we get students to ask questions? How do we get them to see the value in this? Why did you do it that way in the classroom? Yeah.
Yep, yep. And there's always that, why is this still important? And
Yep.
you look at those headlines, on any day of the week and like, there's still stuff going on. This is why we need to know how we
Yep.
got here.
Shockingly, tariffs are back.
Who would have guessed, right? And
I
so,
went for years having to explain what a tariff was
yeah.
and then why people fought over them.
So history does not repeat itself, but it rhymes, as Mark Twain said,
Yes.
Well, Phil, it's been a privilege being in the classroom with you this semester. So
Yes. Likewise.
thank you so much. It's really been a great treat for me. So thanks for being with us here on the podcast too.
Oh, I was happy to do it.
Yeah, so on behalf of Phil Payne, I'm Chris Mackowski. Thanks for being with us here on the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.